If you're American, you may well be familiar with the illustrations of James Montgomery Flagg, but in other countries he's far less well known, even if many are familiar with his Uncle Sam recruitment poster from the First World War. Flagg was born in New York, and by the age of only 14 he was being published in Life magazine. At 15 he was taken on as a staff artist at Judge. But he was determined to learn more and reach his full potential, and from 1894 he also attended the Art Students League of New York for 4 years, and he followed that with another 2 studying art in London and Paris. In 1900, Flagg returned to the United States and quickly found clients eager to use his talents, particularly in magazines. Despite his reputation for realism, Flagg was just as talented as a cartoonist. Among his early humorous creations was the strip Nervy Nat, which was published in Judge for several years. But from the outset he spanned the style spectrum, from simpler graphic cartoons to full-blown oil-on-canvas representation. From 1915 he was also offered increasing amounts of well-paid advertising work, and although he was concerned that this would tarnish his reputation, the money was too tempting for him to resist. In addition to the Uncle Sam poster, Flagg created a lot of propaganda for the American war effort, and this really brought him to the attention of a wider public, making him somewhat of a household name. As with the other realist illustrators of the time, the bulk of Flagg's colour work was usually created in oils, but he also used washes of watercolour over pen and ink when the mood took him. But oils came to dominate his colour illustration, and he generally used a technique which was far more gestural and thinly applied than most of his contemporaries. In monochrome, his facility with pen and ink demonstrated an unparalleled expressive energy and an unerring ability to convey solidity and texture, whether the outcome was serious or comic. In the 20s and 30s, he also turned his talents to both portrait work and caricature of the leading movie stars, as well as the occasional poster. Flagg enjoyed a particularly long and rewarding career into the early 1950s, until old age got the better of him and he died in 1960 in New York at the age of 83. Given his stature as a posterist, there's remarkably little information to be had about French illustrator Roger Broders. He was born in Paris to a wealthy family, and he studied at the prestigious School of Decorative Arts in the city. Once he had completed his studies, he set up in a studio there and began creating fashion illustration for magazines, as well as more graphic work for other clients, including car makers Peugeot. And although competent enough, there was nothing particularly distinctive about his work at this time. Nevertheless, in 1922, Broders was chosen to illustrate a large series of posters for the rail company PLM. And in addition to generous payments for the work, the company also paid for his travel to and accommodation in the various locations to be illustrated. But despite the visually inspirational quality of his subjects, Broders' stylistic approach continued to be fairly unremarkable until 1925, when he began to absorb a stronger Art Deco influence, a more geometric construction in his compositions. The transformation was gradual and far from total, but by 1928 his style had solidified into a more distinctive modernist look which set him apart from other artists. Like many who favoured flat areas of colour, Broders used gouache, and unusually given the large scale of reproduction of the posters, he worked small, typically 18 by 12 inches. His most recognised creations from the later 20s and early 30s depict elegant, languidly posed figures dressed in the latest fashions. The result was visually seductive, and many well-heeled people flocked to these locations from French and other European cities on the strength of the promise of Broders' romanticised images. In 1930, Roger Broders created probably his most extreme abstractions with a pamphlet for the Mont Blanc Company. This made great use of a limited colour palette and geometric humorous characters not seen elsewhere in his work. In a decade, Broders had created about 100 posters for PLM, but in the early 30s the travel work stopped, and evidence of his later work appears only sporadically, and he faded from view well before his death in 1953. American Enoch Bolles is yet another criminally overlooked illustrator, despite being arguably the first modern pin-up artist. Bolles studied at the National Academy of Design, and soon after his earliest illustrations were published in 1914 on the covers of humour magazines, most conspicuously in Judge, with whom he had a 10-year association. But Judge were notoriously unreliable when it came to payment, and he left them in favour of Film Fun, who would become the strongest and longest lasting professional relationship of his career. In 1923 he became their exclusive cover artist, and he produced an incredible 200 illustrations right up until the magazine finally folded in 1943, when censorship laws were toughened up and its content was considered too sexually permissive. And there were around 300 more for a long list of pulp fiction collections which were hugely popular with male readers in their day. In particular, the now misleadingly named Gay Parisienne made great use of Bolles' delightfully provocative girls, isolated on white for their covers. Bolles created his pin-ups using oil paint on canvas, and at close quarters his precision and soft tonal blends are astonishingly accomplished. As far as monochrome work's concerned, there's very little to be found. These images from the pages of Spice's stories are attributed to him, and although I'm not completely convinced if they are his, it's easy to see why his reputation was made with the colour work. Although best known at the time for his pin-ups, he also worked on various ad campaigns, creating many posters and press ads for a wide range of products. His most widely reproduced advertising illustration is this 1937 tonal monochrome press ad for Zippo lighters. Unfortunately, Bolles had a long history of serious mental health problems, and in 1938 they became severe enough for him to be confined to a psychiatric hospital in New Jersey, where he remained for the next 30 years. But he had access to a small art studio, and on his less turbulent days he continued to paint pin-ups for Film Fun until it closed down. Eventually he was considered safe enough to be discharged from hospital in 1969, and although way too old to consider resuming his career, he lived another 7 years before his eventual death from heart failure at the age of 93. Born in what is now Latvia in Eastern Europe, Feodor Rojankovsky studied at the Moscow School of Art, but his studies were cut short by both World War I and the Russian Revolution of 1917, when he was taken prisoner by the Red Army. In the early 1920s he worked as a graphic designer in Poland before moving yet again to France. And there he collaborated with author Esther Averill on a storybook about American hero Daniel Boone. And this book met with considerable success, not least because of Rojankovsky's illustrations. He had a great facility for producing work in various styles using a wide range of media, and he frequently used visually pleasing combinations such as watercolour and crayon within the same illustration. This versatility made him very popular with publishers, and he was hired not only to illustrate children's books, but several books of classic and particularly erotic literature. In 1941, when Germany occupied France during the Second World War, Rojankovsky fled to America, where he soon established himself as a successful and hugely popular illustrator of children's books. His playful and expressive European folk art style was used to great effect in every book he illustrated, and it's fair to say his persistent visual imagination made some very dull writing come alive for the young readers. Among these were several upbeat reworkings of tales by the Brothers Grimm. Even at the height of his success in America as a children's illustrator, the dates reveal that Rojankovsky continued to create sexually explicit material for adults, but it's highly unlikely that the children's publishers in the States were aware of his pornographic alter ego. By the early 1950s, Rojankovsky had amassed quite a lot of money, and he used it to have a second home built on the French Riviera. In 1960, he left America to live and work there full-time. But by 1965, he had reached his mid-70s, and unfortunately his eyesight was failing fast. He returned to the States for eye surgery, which was only partially successful, and he died there 5 years later in 1970. By his mid-teens, American illustrator Ralph Barton had already had several cartoons and illustrations published in local newspapers in Kansas. In 1908, at the age of 17, he went to study at the Art Institute of Chicago, but he wasn't happy there, and after a few months returned to his hometown and continued to sell his cartoons to the papers. His first real break came in 1912 when Barton sent an illustration to Puck magazine, which they published. On the strength of this, he took a huge gamble and moved his family to New York. Luckily, this reckless move paid off, and Puck was soon providing him with regular work, including many covers. And the high profile this association gave his distinctive, quirky cartoon style naturally led to many others seeking Barton out for his illustrative talent. And by the early 20s, Barton's illustration work was seen frequently on the covers and interior pages of all the glossy humour and style publications, including Life magazine, The New Yorker, and Judge. Barton was also in great demand for bookwork, and he illustrated the cover and contents of one of the 1920s most popular books, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes by Anita Loos. And in 1924 he had almost as much success with his cheerfully rude duotone illustrations for the ribald tales of French author Honoré de Balzac. Although it's generally accurate to consider Barton an Art Deco stylist, he was never hidebound by its more formal constraints, and there was an equal measure of Beardsley's elegance to be found too. He was an illustrator with little need of colour, but when he used it he did so with imagination and as much precision as gouache painting would allow. Barton was a popular man who enjoyed the acquaintance of the famous and powerful of New York and Hollywood. He had an impressive income and a glamorous lifestyle. But like Enoch Bolles, he too had mental health problems. He was beset by manic depression, and in 1931, shortly before his 40th birthday, Barton decided he'd had enough of life and shot himself in the head. Any memory of him or his work soon began to fade away, and sadly he remains an almost forgotten figure. And on that rather depressing note, we come to the end of this instalment. I hope I see you next time.